He read the name on the invitation list and smiled the way a man smiles when he believes he has already won. Dominic Ashworth had spent 11 years building the kind of name that got you into rooms most people never knew existed. His consulting firm, Ashworth and Crane Advisory, had offices in Toronto, Calgary, and Vancouver. His suits were made in Milan. His watches told time in 3 cities simultaneously, as though his life were too large for a single time zone. And on the first Saturday of October, he was hosting what the lifestyle section of the Globe and Mail had already called the most anticipated private gala of the autumn season. A fundraiser at the Fairmont Royal York, ballroom level, chandeliers and white tablecloths and champagne that cost more per bottle than most people spent on groceries in a fortnight. He had sent the invitation to Priscilla Dankwa himself, not through his assistant, not through the charity committee, himself. He had typed her full name into the guest list field and pressed confirm, and the satisfaction he felt doing it was something he did not examine too closely, because if he had, he might have recognized it for what it was. The particular cruelty of a man who had convinced himself that cruelty was something else entirely. He called it closure. He called it perspective. He told his fiancée, Margot, that inviting Priscilla was simply the decent thing to do. She helped build some of the early network, he said, not looking up from his phone. It would be strange not to include her. Margot, who was 31 and beautiful, and had never once questioned why Dominic had left his marriage, nodded and said, "Of course." What Dominic did not say. What he had not said to anyone, not to Margot, not to his business partner, Jeffrey Crane, not to his lawyer, not to himself in any honest way, was that he wanted Priscilla Zankwa to walk into that ballroom and see what he had become without her. He wanted her to see the flowers and the crystal and the 300 guests, and Margot in her ivory Elie Saab dress. And he wanted her to understand, in whatever wordless language pride communicates to the people it has discarded, that she had been a chapter, a useful chapter, certainly, but a chapter that was finished. He had reduced her, in his mind, to a footnote. What he did not know. What he could not have known, because he had stopped paying attention to Priscilla Dankwa the moment she stopped being useful to him, was what she had done in the 4 years since the divorce. Priscilla received the invitation on a Tuesday morning in the executive suite of a building on King Street West that her company had purchased outright 18 months prior. Her assistant, a composed young woman named Thea, set it on the corner of her desk between a briefing document and a cold cup of espresso. The envelope was cream-colored and heavy and embossed with the Fairmont crest. Priscilla recognized the charity, a children's literacy foundation, legitimate and well-regarded, and she recognized the name on the return address without needing to read it twice. She set the envelope down. She picked up her espresso. She looked out through the floor-to-ceiling glass at the Toronto skyline, at the lake sitting flat and silver in the October morning, and she thought about what it meant that Dominic Ashworth had sent this to her personally. She had not needed to think about it long. "Thea," she said, "please confirm my attendance." Thea paused in the doorway. "Should I note any dietary requirements?" "Standard," Priscilla said. "And tell them I'll need 3 additional seats." She said it the way she said most things. Evenly, without drama, as though the decision had already been made somewhere deeper than the moment of speaking. What Dominic knew about Priscilla Dankwa at the time of their divorce was this. She was 40 years old. She had grown up in Scarborough, in a house with a furnace that broke every February. She had put herself through Ryerson on a combination of loans and overnight shifts at a logistics company. She had married him at 32, when he was still building the consultancy from a rented desk in a co-working space in Liberty Village. And she had spent 8 years managing his books, cultivating his client relationships, writing the proposal language that won 3 of his 5 biggest contracts, and raising their daughter, Kezia, mostly alone while he flew to conferences in cities that were not Toronto. What he did not know, what he had chosen not to see, was that Priscilla had been running a side operation throughout the last 3 years of their marriage. Not secretly. She had told him about it. He had listened with the half attention of a man who has already decided that what someone is saying is not important. She was building a data infrastructure firm aimed at the logistics sector. Her background, her knowledge, the thing she understood better than almost anyone because she had lived inside it before she had ever lived inside his world. He had called it a hobby. He had said, more than once, that she should focus on what mattered. By the time the divorce was finalized, ODP Logistics Tech had 4 enterprise clients and a seed round of $2.3 million. By the time Dominic sent the invitation, it had 47 clients, offices in Toronto and Montreal, and a new one in Mississauga, a Series B round of $38 million, and a profile in Report on Business that called Priscilla Danquois one of the most quietly consequential founders in Canadian tech. She had not publicized the profile herself. She did not do much of anything to publicize herself. She had learned, over the years, that the people who needed to know about her would find their way to her, and the people who didn't would simply not notice until they did. Dominic had not noticed. The evening of the gala was cold in the way Toronto gets cold in October. Not the deep bone cold of January, but the kind that comes with sharp wind off the lake and leaves that are still mostly on the trees, but not for much longer. Priscilla arrived at the Fairmont at 7:43. She came in a car she owned, driven by a man who had worked for her for 2 years, and she arrived with 3 people who were not bodyguards in any theatrical sense, though 2 of them were built like people who could handle a room if a room needed handling. The third was her head of legal, a woman named Camille Prempa, who had been with ODP from the beginning and who had spent the past 6 months quietly and carefully preparing documentation that was relevant, in several ways, to the evening ahead. Priscilla wore black. She wore it the way she wore most things, not to be noticed, but because she had long since stopped wearing things for reasons other than her own. The doorman held the door. The lobby of the Fairmont was warm and bright and smelled of cut flowers. A woman at the check-in table found her name on the list and looked up with the particular expression of someone whose smile has just been replaced by something more complicated. "Miss Danquois," the woman said. "Welcome." And she glanced at the 3 people behind Priscilla. "Your guests?" "They're with me," Priscilla said. They were shown to a table near the center of the room. Not the back, center. Dominic saw her before Margot did. He was standing near the bar with his business partner and 2 clients from Calgary, holding a glass of scotch and laughing at something that had just been said. And then the laughing stopped with the abruptness of a door closing, because across the room, at a table that should have been occupied by a woman he had mentally filed under before, was Priscilla Danquois. And she was not sitting alone, and she was not sitting quietly. And she was not doing what he had imagined she would do, which was to appear and to look around and to feel in some nonverbal register that he would somehow be able to detect from across a ballroom the appropriate amount of smallness. She was not small. She was talking to someone at the table next to hers. A man Dominic recognized after a second as Warren Theriot, the managing director of Northbridge Capital, which was one of the most active growth equity funds in the country, and a firm that Dominic had been trying to get a meeting with for 7 months. They were laughing, not performing laughter, laughing. Dominic's glass was suddenly heavier in his hand. "Isn't that?" his business partner began. "Yes," Dominic said. "I didn't know she knew Warren." "She doesn't," Dominic said, and then registered immediately that this was not something he actually knew. Priscilla had known Warren Theriot for 2 years. They had met at a founders' dinner in Waterloo, sat next to each other by accident, and discovered within 20 minutes that they had overlapping interests in logistic infrastructure and an overlapping opinion of a particular venture capital firm in San Francisco that shall go unnamed. They had stayed in touch. Northbridge had participated in ODP's Series B. She had not announced any of this. She had simply known it, the way she knew most things that mattered, quietly and ahead of schedule. The program began at 8:30. The charity's executive director spoke. A local politician spoke. There was a video. Then came the awards portion, 3 individuals being recognized for their contributions to childhood literacy across Ontario. The third name called was Priscilla O.C. Dankwa. ODP Logistics Tech had, 18 months prior, donated the technical infrastructure for a province-wide digital reading program. Servers, software, implementation support, ongoing maintenance. The donation had been made without a press release. Priscilla had asked the charity not to publicize it until they had data on outcomes. The data now showed that 42,000 children in underserved communities across Ontario had accessed the program. Reading scores in participating schools had improved measurably. The charity had wanted to recognize her for the past year. She had asked them to wait until the numbers were worth talking about. She rose from the table and walked to the stage, and the room applauded in that particular way a room applauds when it recognizes that it is witnessing something it did not know it was going to witness. She was brief. She spoke about Scarborough. She spoke about a library branch on Lawrence Avenue, where she had spent most of her childhood Saturday mornings, because the branch had heat, and her house did not always. She said she did not believe in charity for its own sake, but in building systems that made charity unnecessary. She said she hoped these children would grow up to build things, and that someone would have the sense to get out of their way when they did. The room was very quiet. Then it was very loud. Dominic stood in the lobby during the applause. He had stepped out before she finished speaking, not because he planned to, but because he found he could not stay still in his chair, and standing at the back of the room did not feel right either. So he had walked out and was now standing near a pillar in the lobby, his scotch replaced by water he did not remember acquiring. Margot found him there. She just gave the most incredible speech, Margot said. She was glowing with the kind of uncomplicated admiration that people feel when they do not yet understand all the context. Did you know she built that reading program? Warren Theriot was saying, ODP is probably the most underrated tech company in the country right now. He said Northbridge is. I know, Dominic said. Margot looked at him. Are you all right? He said yes. He was not all right. What Dominic was processing, standing in the lobby of the Fairmont Royal York on the first Saturday in October, was not a single realization but a sequence of them, arriving one after another, like the cars of a very long train. That Priscilla had built something significant while he was not paying attention. That Warren Theriot knew her name and laughed with her, like someone who respected her. That the room had gone quiet for her in a way it had not gone quiet for anyone else that evening, including him. That she had come to this gala not as someone he had invited, but as someone who had been invited by the charity itself, in a category he had not known existed before tonight, as a recipient of recognition she had not sought and did not need him to validate. That the invitation he had sent her, the one he had told himself, was about closure, about perspective, about being the bigger person, had not in fact been about any of those things. That she had known this, that she had come anyway, that she had not come for him at all. Priscilla returned to her table after the stage. Camille was there, and Warren, and the 2 men who worked for her and who had the quiet competence of people who knew how to be useful without being asked. A woman from the charity board came to the table and took Priscilla's hands in both of hers and said things that were genuine and specific. A journalist from the Toronto Star asked politely if she would have time for a brief conversation. She said, yes, next week, through Thea. At 9:53, she looked across the room. Dominic was back at his table. Margot was beside him, talking to someone. He was not talking to anyone. He was looking at his phone in the way people look at their phones when they are not actually looking at their phones. He looked up. They held each other's gaze for a moment. She did not smile. She did not look away first. She simply looked at him with the expression of a woman who had long since decided that his opinion of her had never been the relevant variable. And then she returned her attention to the people at her table, who were saying something that made her laugh. And the laugh was real, and it carried across the room in the light way real laughter carries. The last thing of significance to happen that evening occurred not in the ballroom, but in the corridor. Outside the coat check at 20 past 10, Dominic found her there. He had told himself he wasn't looking for her. He was looking for the coat check. These things were both partly true. Priscilla, he said. She turned. She was putting on her coat. Camel wool, well made, nothing showy. Dominic, she said. He had prepared something to say. He had been preparing it since the lobby, revising it in the margins of his attention throughout the evening. Something measured and gracious. Something that acknowledged her success without conceding too much. Something that struck the right note between the man who had invited her and the man who now found himself unexpectedly outmaneuvered on his own evening. What came out was, "You could have told me." She finished buttoning her coat. She looked at him with the seal of someone who has anticipated this conversation and is not angry about it, which is its own kind of formidable. "Told you what?" she said. "About all of this, what you were building. I didn't know it had gotten this far." She was quiet for a moment. Not an uncomfortable quiet. The quiet of a person deciding what is worth saying. "I did tell you," she said, "many times. You weren't listening." He had no answer for this, because it was simply true. "I hope the gala went well for the charity," she said. "It's a good cause. Congratulations on the Ashworth and Crane anniversary." She said it without irony. She said it because she meant it, or close enough to it that the distinction no longer mattered to her. Then she walked out through the lobby doors into the October night. And the woman who worked in legal was waiting. And the car was waiting. And the city was bright and cold and indifferent. In the way cities are indifferent to the private reckonings of the people moving through them. 3 days later, a story ran in Report on Business under the headline, "ODP Logistics Tech confirms $60 M Series C, targets U.S. expansion by Q2. It included a photograph of Priscilla Sosi Danqua standing in the ODP offices on King Street West. She was looking slightly off camera, not at the photographer. She was wearing a plain dark blazer. She looked like someone who had somewhere to be. The article mentioned briefly that she had recently been honored at the Fairmont Royal York Gala. It did not mention Dominic Ashworth. Dominic saw the article on Thursday morning on his phone before he had gotten out of bed. He read it twice. He thought about the 8 years. He thought about the proposal language and the client dinners and the years he had spent traveling while she had been building something, quietly and without his permission or his attention, in the margins of a life he had assumed was primarily his. He thought about the look on Warren Theriot's face when he'd said her name. "Oh, Priscilla. Yes, we go back a bit." He put his phone down on the bedside table and looked at the ceiling for a long time. Margot was asleep beside him. He did not wake her. Kezia Ashworth was 23, in her second year of a master's program in public policy at the University of Toronto. She had her mother's face and her mother's habit of speaking only when she had something to say. She had watched her parents' marriage end with the quiet attentiveness of a child who understands more than the adults around her have accounted for. And she had spent the subsequent 4 years watching her mother build something extraordinary and her father mistake his own comfort for superiority. She called her mother on the Sunday after the gala. "I saw the article," she said. "I know," Priscilla said. "Are you happy?" Priscilla was in her kitchen. She was making egusi soup. It was raining outside. The windows were steamed slightly from the pot. She had music playing, Asa, low, and the apartment smelled of palm oil and crayfish and the specific warmth of a Sunday afternoon that belongs entirely to you. She thought about the question. "Yes," she said, not triumphantly, not with the particular weight the word would have carried if she had been speaking to or about Dominic. Just yes. The simple, unornamented yes of a woman describing her own life. "Good," Kezia said. They talked for 40 minutes about Kezia's thesis and a new restaurant on Bloor Street, and whether they should go to Accra for Christmas or wait until March when the weather would be better. They talked the way people talk when there is nothing they need to perform for each other. When Priscilla hung up, the soup was ready. She served it in a bowl she had bought at a market in Kensington 15 years ago, when she was still working overnight shifts and Dominic was still at the co-working space. And the future was something she was building with her hands before she fully knew what shape it would take. She sat by the window. The rain was slowing down. Somewhere below King Street was doing what King Street always did on a Sunday evening: filling up, emptying out, continuing. She ate her soup. She thought about the children who were reading books now because of a program built on infrastructure her company had donated. She thought about the 42,000. She thought about the library on Lawrence Avenue, the way the heat would hit you when you came in from the cold, the smell of that particular carpet in the children's section that she had never been able to fully describe to anyone. She thought, I came from there, and I came here, and I did it myself, not with bitterness. Without it, actually. There is a difference between a woman who has survived and a woman who has built, and the difference is that the second one does not need the first story to define her anymore. Outside, the rain stopped. The city settled into the particular quiet of a Sunday evening. Not silence, but a lower frequency, a gentler register. And Priscilla Osidankwa sat in it the way she sat in most things that were hers. Without apology, without hurry, without waiting for anyone to tell her she had earned it. She had already known that,